Wow, I can certainly understand why the subtitle of your book is, the book America's Ticking Bankruptcy Bomb. The subtitle is this, and I didn't read it. It certainly brings it home after your speech. How the looming debt crisis threatens the American dream and how we can turn the tide before it's too late. So let's hope people are listening to you quite clearly. Now, the next speaker is Donn Deers. Donn began a career with General Electric, spent many years with General Electric, which my father worked for as well, as my daughter knows, who's sitting right there. He began his career on their test engineering program, testing large steam turbines and generators used by utilities to generate electricity. This was followed by 3 years on General Electric's manufacturing management program, where he worked in a variety of departments, including small jet engines, naval ordnance, locomotion, and medium steam turbines. Dan has established facilities around the world to service power generation, transmission, and other equipment. At every step, he's been involved in work done right at the customer location, so he's certainly not a theoretician. He's a very practical man. He's been working at steel mills, electric utilities, refineries, open pit underground mining operations. He's seen it all. Following his retirement as a General Electric senior executive, Donn continued to study and write about energy issues. He's currently president of TS August, a 501c3 think tank comprised entirely of volunteers. He writes for that website, actually, tsaugust.org, as well as powerforusa.com, and I've put a link on our website to that, a very good webpage. He has written 2 books and various papers, and as we'll see today, he speaks about energy issues. And I'd like to salute him, especially because he's a graduate of the United States Merchant Marine Academy and served on active duty in the U.S. Navy. I was in the Canadian Navy, so I salute you.
Great. Thank you very much. What do I push? Which? Okay, very good. We can get by that. Title of my presentation is CO2's Fool's Errand. The UN says that we've got to cut our CO2 emissions 80% by 2050 or there'll be a catastrophe. Well, what does that mean for the United States? Well, we could, if we went to great lengths, which I'll talk about, if we did cut them by 80%, what that would really do, though, is mean that we would cut our per capita CO2 emissions by almost 90% because of our population growth. Today, we're about 20 tons per person. We'd go down to about 2.4 tons per person as we grow our country to 420 million people. Now, 2.4 tons per person, back at the turn of the last century, is where we'd have to be, and we didn't have very many automobiles or airplanes or computers or things like that that used energy. So, where do our CO2 emissions come from? Well, 40% come from generating electricity, 20% from gasoline, and 40% from all other sources. So let's look at the generation of electricity. On the left is a chart that shows how we generate electricity by coal, nuclear, and natural gas. In the center, we see a chart of where the CO2 emissions that those produce. And as you can see, coal amounts to about 80%, and natural gas about 20%. The chart to the right shows where we will have to be in terms of how much generating capacity we'll have to have in the year 2050. And that's based on a 1% annual growth rate for the use of electricity, which is the lowest growth rate that we've ever had. It's also just about the same as our population growth rate. It means we have to add about 600,000 megawatts of new generating capacity. But where is that going to come from? There will be, probably, if we pursue this road, a shortfall of electricity in 2050. First of all, if you look at the chart on the right, it shows that we can only release from the generation of electricity about 411 million metric tons of natural gas, of CO2 in the year 2050. But our existing natural gas power plants almost already produce that much CO2. So in effect, we cannot add any new natural gas power plants. So then what are we going to do? Well, we could add wind, which we've heard a lot about, and solar. But wind has a very low capacity factor, 30% on average. And in addition to that, the grid can only accept 20% of its electricity coming from intermittent, unreliable sources. So if we built enough wind turbines and solar facilities to fill up that 20%, we would be able to generate enough electricity and have the capacity as shown in the green, which leaves the shortfall at the top by not having enough capacity. To do this, we'd have to build over 600,000 wind turbines between now and 2050. Now, if you just drop down the chart a little bit, you see coal. Well, coal, this represents the same number of coal-fired power plants, but in order to allow us to capture that CO2 and then sequester it, we have to derate the coal-fired power plants by between 30 and 40%, because the electricity, rather than going to the grid, is used to run the pumps and the equipment to capture the CO2. So following this scenario of cutting CO2 will produce at least a 24% shortfall of electricity, unless we build 300 or more new nuclear power plants rated at 1,000 megawatts, or 300 integrated gasification combined cycle power plants also rated at 1,000 megawatts. But the story gets a little worse because there's a very strong probability that we cannot sequester under the ground these millions and millions of tons of CO2, which means that coal cannot be used at all to generate electricity. Even that integrated gasification combined cycle power plant that costs as much as a nuclear power plant, we won't even be able to use those. So in that case, we're going to have a shortfall of electricity of over 40%, unless we build 500 or more nuclear power plants. Now, that takes the picture of the situation with generating electricity. It's not very likely that we can even cut CO2 emissions by 80%. But then what about gasoline? Well, we go through the same type of exercise. On the left-hand side, we see the number of millions of metric tons of CO2 that gasoline emits today. In the middle is the number of metric tons that will be produced in 2050 if our population grows as forecast and people buy automobiles as they have in the past. So how do we do that? How do we cut that down to 230 million metric tons, which is an 80% cut? Well, the one way we could do it is to have battery electric vehicles, pure electric vehicles. We could actually have 95 million battery electric vehicles. We could cut the CO2 emissions down to that first dashed line. Now, 95 million is the maximum that we could have without having to build new power plants. That's the theoretical maximum. Then if we took the rest of our cars and we doubled the mileage that we got for miles per gallon, we could cut it again down to the next dotted line. But that leaves us with a shortfall showing that we virtually impossible to get down to cutting our emissions by 80%. Now, what about the other sources of emission? Well, the other 40% of CO2 that we generate comes from trucks, which we need, planes, railroads, heating of homes, and industry. It will be no easier to cut each of these by 80% than it will be to cut the 80% from the generation of electricity or the use of gasoline. What we are going through right now in making efforts to cut CO2 is a waste of effort and money. Renewable portfolio standards are terrible. They promote the use of wind and solar, which are highly inefficient. Net metering and feed-in tariffs are terrible. Of course, cap and trade is dead, but we still have these cap and trade areas within the country, in the New England area and in the West Coast and so forth. Biofuels, big problem. And they're stopping the use of ultra-supercritical coal-fired power plants, which are tremendously efficient. They're 40% more efficient than our existing coal-fired power plants. Rather than going down that road, what we really need to do is to adopt energy policies supporting economic growth. We need to open up all the areas that are currently prohibited by the government for drilling. We need to open up the Outer Continental Shelf. We need to open up federal lands. We need to drill in Alaska and Anwar. And we need to promote and continue to promote fracking rather than taking efforts to try and stop fracking or curtail its use. We need to build new nuclear power plants, not necessarily the big ones, but the new small modular unit power plants that are being developed today. We need to build ultra-supercritical coal-fired power plants. We're building one in Arkansas, and we've had a heck of a time doing that. China's building 20. Europe is even building one or two. And I suspect that Germany is going to have to build ultra-supercritical coal-fired power plants because of their shutting down of the nuclear, of all their nuclear plants. What we also need to do, obviously, is to continue with our research and development. For example, the methane hydrates are plentiful around the world, and they would provide a cheap source of natural gas if we can extract it economically. So that is the conclusion that I've reached, which is we need to stop this fool's errand of trying to cut CO2 emissions, which is virtually impossible, and to promote policies that generate and improve our economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.